Picture the worst Monday morning of your entire life. Now multiply that by 1,000, subtract your human rights, add a stranger's ring on your finger, and you're still not even close to what this little girl experienced. She was 6 years old. 6. The age when your biggest crisis is deciding which snack to beg your mother for, the age when the most complex negotiation you should ever be involved in is trading your vegetables for extra dessert. She was chasing her wooden doll through wet garden grass, laughing at absolutely nothing the way only children can, when the thunder of hooves shattered the afternoon air. Men on horseback stormed through the gate. They smelled like horses, stale wine, and absolutely terrible life choices. One of them dropped to his knee before her father, unrolled a parchment sealed in wax, and her father read it once, read it twice, then slowly turned to look at his 6-year-old daughter. Not with love, not with worry, with the eyes of a man who had just discovered his savings account had money in it. That parchment was a marriage contract. His daughter, his child, had just been sold to a grown man she had never met to secure a political alliance nobody bothered to explain to her in words a 6-year-old could understand. And every adult in that great hall was smiling about it, laughing, clinking cups. And she stood there, muddy dress, wooden doll in hand, not yet knowing that this was the last truly free afternoon of her entire life. The very next morning, her dolls were gone, packed away without ceremony, without warning, without even a goodbye. "Ladies do not play with toys," her governess announced. "Ain't replacing the dolls with a needle and thread and the energy of someone who had personally never experienced joy." She was 6 years old and already being retrained like a puppy who had the audacity to believe she had a personality. The lessons began immediately. Not reading, not numbers. Curtsies so deep her knees kissed the stone floor. Foreign phrases that twisted her tongue into knots. And every single morning, her mother pressed herbal tonics into her hands and whispered, with the kind of haunted voice that should have raised alarm bells for everyone in the room, "For your future husband, to strengthen your womb." Her womb. She was still losing baby teeth. There were literal gaps in her mouth where her teeth used to live, and these people were already drafting her reproductive schedule like she was a piece of farming land. By age 7, the medical inspections started. A parade of physicians and midwives trooped into her chamber on a rotating basis. They pressed rough hands against her small belly, muttered about humors and breeding potential, and nodded at each other with the clinical detachment of men who had never once stopped to consider that a child was standing in front of them. One grizzled old doctor, who had clearly never been introduced to the concept of shame, looked her over, nodded once, and announced, "She'll do nicely, once she's old enough." The way he said old enough made her skin crawl in ways she was too young to understand, but old enough to fear. Her father beamed like he had just won a horse race. She crawled under her blankets and begged God for this to be a nightmare. God, as it turned out, was busy. The day of the betrothal arrived like bad weather nobody warned you about. She was dressed in a brocade gown so heavy it felt like wearing a small house. The chapel smelled of incense and old stone, and the quiet desperation of every woman who had stood in it before her. At the altar stood her groom. 32 years old, flushed red from ale he had apparently been drinking since breakfast, scanning her the way a merchant examines a bolt of cloth for defects. She was 7. His boots were older than she was. The vows were mumbled. Hers were scripted entirely for her, because she was 7 and could barely pronounce half the words. His were slightly slurred because courage, apparently, came in a goblet. A gold ring was placed on her finger, heavy, oversized, and sliding around her tiny hand like a shackle that had been made for someone else entirely. He leaned in and kissed her. He smelled like ale and old leather and several questionable decisions. The crowd erupted in cheers, and somewhere beneath the weight of her 2 large crowns sliding over her eyes, under the crushing fabric of that ridiculous gown, the childhood of a 7-year-old girl was quietly suffocated and buried without a funeral. That night, while the feast roared below and adults celebrated their excellent political scheming, she curled up in a strange bed in a strange house and held tightly to the small cloth doll she had smuggled beneath her shawl, because she was still, beneath all of it, a child. Her new home was a fortress 3 days' ride from everything she had ever known. The walls were cold. The corridors were long and full of echoes. The servants spoke in dialects she didn't recognize. And the welcome gift, cheerfully delivered by the maids while unpacking her miniature trunks, was the news that her husband's first wife had died in childbirth. At 15. "We hope you'll be luckier," one of the maids said brightly, folding a small dress with a smile. She said nothing, but something cold moved through her. For the next 2 years, she existed in a strange in-between. Too young to be a real wife, too married to be a real child. The court physicians visited monthly, examined her, and delivered their verdict to a room full of men who discussed her body the way traders discuss inventory, with professional distance and zero concern for the inventory's feelings. "Not yet ready," they announced each time, and everyone nodded. Monin waited. And she waited too, which was somehow the worst part of all, because the waiting wasn't kindness. It was a countdown. At 10 years old, she was transferred to her husband's court, like a crate of fine wine, valuable, not yet to be opened. The carriage ride took days. The roads were terrible. Every bump was a reminder of exactly what she was now. Not a daughter, not a person, not a child, but a commodity with a destination. Life at her husband's court was a fairy tale written by someone who hated children. Mornings were embroidery lessons, where she stitched fertility symbols into silk while her pricked fingers bled onto the cloth. Afternoons were dance instruction, hours of forcing her feet into leather shoes 2 sizes too tight, learning to glide like a swan while her heart hammered like a bird that had just realized the cage was permanent. The ladies at court adored her. "Such a little queen," they cooed, with smiles that were perfectly shaped knives. Behind their fans, they whispered things she was not supposed to hear. She heard all of them. She stored every word in a quiet, frightened place inside herself and kept moving, kept curtsying, kept smiling the smile she had been trained to perform. At 12, the inspections intensified. A midwife with hands like bark checked her monthly with zero gentleness and maximum thoroughness. The first blood came at 12. And before she had even processed what it meant for herself, the news had traveled through the entire court like wildfire through dry grass. Her husband summoned her that same afternoon, and his face was flushed. His hand came down on her shoulder like a stone dropped from a great height. "Soon," he said, with a smile she wanted to run from. She nodded. She smiled. She performed every trained gesture perfectly. Inside, she was screaming so loudly she was surprised no one could hear it. The court stopped pretending to be kind. Rivals, older women with curves and cunning and years of political survival behind them, circled her like wolves who had just spotted something smaller and slower. They called her the doll wife and snickered at her braids. One of them slipped a fertility charm into her food. It tasted like dirt and old roots and quiet humiliation. She ate it anyway because she had been trained too well to forget her manners, even in the middle of being degraded. Nights became the territory of her darkest thoughts. Alone in her bed, she pulled her knees to her chest and constructed elaborate escape fantasies, climbing out through arrow-slit windows, disguising herself as a traveling boy, joining performers on the road, dying dramatically of a beautiful illness like the heroines in the stories she no longer had time to read. But she could not do any of those things. She could only wait. And the waiting stretched her last threads of childhood until they snapped clean. She was 13 when the night arrived. The older women prepared her with the enthusiasm of people who had long since buried their own memories of being 13. Their advice ranged from useless, "Think of your duty, dear," to genuinely terrifying, as one of them pressed a folded leather strap into her hand and said, without blinking, "Now bite down on this if it becomes too much." She stared at the strap. The bedding ceremony proceeded as tradition demanded, which is to say, a crowd of nobles marched her to the marriage bed, laughing, plucking at her sleeves, pulling back the covers, making jokes she didn't fully understand but feared completely. The cheers that followed seeped through the curtains and into her bones like something that could never be washed out. Come morning, she lay still and stared at the ceiling beams for a very long time. It hurt in ways she had no words for. His weight was crushing. The sounds he made were animal. She clenched her fists until her nails drew blood from her own palms. She bit her lip until she tasted iron. She did not scream. She had been trained not to make scenes. When it was over, he slept soundly. Morshi lay beside him and bled quietly into expensive linens. The sheets were inspected and paraded the next morning as proof of her womanhood. The court applauded this information enthusiastically. She smiled the smile she had been practicing since she was 6 years old. 6 months later, she was pregnant at 14. The court celebrated. She vomited into a chamber pot and tried to understand what exactly was being celebrated. The pregnancy was a new kind of suffering, nausea that lasted weeks, bone-deep exhaustion, physicians monitoring her constantly, prodding her belly, measuring her progress, discussing her body in clinical terms while she sat in the room pretending she wasn't there. Labor began 3 days before her 15th birthday and lasted 36 hours. No relief beyond herbs that barely dulled the edge of an agony that felt like being split down the middle. Midwives told her to breathe through it. She screamed until her throat bled raw. Then she kept screaming because there was simply no other available option. She survived. The baby, a son, lived for 4 hours before slipping away like breath on cold glass. She had not even had time to properly name him in her own heart before her husband was at her bedside, face tight with fury about his lost heir, demanding she be ready to try again. Her stitches had not healed. She was burning with fever. Physicians applied leeches to draw out the sickness, medieval medicine's charming solution to blood loss being, brilliantly, more blood loss. She endured the leeches in silence. She endured everything in silence. She had been trained for exactly this. She survived. Barely. But her body remembered everything. At 15, she was a widow. Her husband died of fever. Quickly. Without warning, without apology, she inherited his debts, a title she could not legally claim, and enough layered trauma to outlast several lifetimes. For 3 months, she breathed air that felt, for the first time she could remember, like it actually belonged to her. Then her brother-in-law arrived with another contract, because her womb, apparently, was still considered a viable asset, despite the fever, despite the grief, despite the baby who had not survived. Someone had reviewed the ledgers of her suffering and determined she was still worth something as a future mother. She was to be remarried, this time to a duke twice her age with 6 children from 2 previous wives. And both previous wives had died young. This fact was presented to her without irony. Her new husband's court was a nest of calculated cruelty. His children from previous marriages viewed her as a direct threat to their inheritance and made no effort to hide it. His eldest daughter, who happened to be exactly her age, made eye contact across the dining table on the first evening with an expression that communicated clearly, "I am watching you." The new husband was not unkind, exactly, but he was not interested in her as a person. He was interested in her as a continuation of his bloodline, and he pursued that interest with the focused energy of a man running a business. She became pregnant, miscarried at 6 months, became pregnant again, miscarried again. The cycle moved through her like seasons, predictable, inevitable, and twice as brutal as anything she had ever been prepared for. At 18, she finally produced a surviving son. The court erupted in celebration. She collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion before the cheering had even finished. During her recovery, whispers circulated about finding her husband a second wife to assist with the breeding duties. She was 18 years old. She had been pregnant more times than she had celebrated birthdays as a free child, and she was already being discussed as if she were a well-used tool that might need replacing. She looked into a mirror during those recovery weeks and did not recognize the face looking back at her. The woman in the mirror was old in ways that had nothing to do with years. Her eyes held things that eyes that age should not hold. And her body bore the evidence of everything she had been put through. The aching hips, the curved spine from carrying babies before her own bones had finished their growing, the chronic cough that the physicians could not explain and would never fully cure. She had been currency. She had been livestock. She had been a vessel and a trophy and a political pawn and a breeding investment. At 22, the count stood at this: 2 husbands buried, 4 children born, 2 surviving, countless examinations, inspections, negotiations, and indignities endured. A body permanently altered by experiences no child should have survived. A life lived almost entirely in service of other people's ambitions. And then, one day, another marriage proposal arrived. Another aging lord, another contract, and another man who had reviewed her record and decided her proven fertility made her worth acquiring. She read the contract, she set it down, and for the first time in her entire life, she said no. Her surviving children gave her political leverage she had not had before. Her lands provided income. Her reputation, survivor, widow, twice over, woman who had outlasted everything the world had thrown at her, made even her most dangerous enemies pause before moving against her. Nobody had taught her to do this. She had learned it herself, in the spaces between all the things she had been forced to endure, in the quiet of feverish nights, in the years of performing smiles that hid screaming. She had, without anyone's permission or assistance, learned what she was worth. The 6-year-old girl who lost her wooden dolls in a garden she never got to run through again would not have recognized the woman she became, but she would have been proud, because she did not just survive what the world decided to make her. She refused, in the end, to let that be the only thing she was. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Lasting Legacy right now. These stories take real research and real love to tell, and every subscriber is a reason for us to keep going. Hit the subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. We read every single one. Stay curious, honor the past, build your lasting legacy.